Bikers harass a lone woman at night. When she turns around, they freeze in fear. It was a quiet night on a deserted stretch of road, the kind where the only sounds were the low hum of tires on asphalt and the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. The headlights of the woman's car cut through the darkness, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch endlessly into the horizon. The road seemed to go on forever, with no signs of civilization for miles. Her hands gripped the steering wheel, fingers tapping gently in time with the music playing softly in the background. She was used to driving alone at night, a habit she had formed over the years. There was a peace in the solitude, a sense of freedom that came with the quiet of the open road. But tonight was different. As her car rounded a bend, she saw them. 6 bikers, their motorcycles lined up along the side of the road like an intimidating barrier. The soft rumble of their engines seemed to vibrate in the air, a constant reminder of the presence they claimed over the night. Their helmets gleamed under the dim glow of her headlights, and their jackets were as dark as the night itself. For a moment, she considered turning around, taking the next exit, finding another route. But something inside her told her to keep going, to face whatever lay ahead. She took a deep breath, steadying herself as she approached the bikers. As her car neared them, one of the bikers raised his hand, signaling her to stop. She slowed down, coming to a halt a few feet away from the group. The sound of her engine sputtered to silence as she rolled down her window, her eyes fixed on the bikers. "Hey, sweetheart," one of them called out with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "What's a pretty thing like you doing out here all alone?" She met his gaze, her expression calm, unreadable. "Just passing through," she replied, her voice steady. "I'm not lost." The biker stepped closer, his boots thudding on the asphalt. "You sure about that? Looks like you could use some company. It's not safe out here for someone like you." The other bikers chuckled, their voices deep and mocking. They circled her car, their movements calculated, each one leaning in, trying to get a reaction. There was no malice in their eyes yet, just the thrill of the hunt, the excitement of intimidating someone who seemed vulnerable. "Maybe you should pull over and keep us company for a while," the leader of the group said, leaning down to peer through her window. "We could show you a good time." She didn't flinch. Instead, her eyes remained locked on the leader's face, her gaze unwavering. "I'm not interested," she said softly, but firmly. "I think you should move along." The leader frowned, taken aback by her calm demeanor. He was used to seeing fear, hearing the desperation in people's voices. It was part of the game, the power play, the thrill of intimidating someone weaker. But this woman didn't seem scared. In fact, she seemed almost bored. He stepped back, eyeing her suspiciously. "Oh, I get it," he sneered. "You think you're too good for us, huh? Think you can just roll through and ignore us? You've got another thing coming." His words were meant to provoke, but she didn't rise to the bait. Instead, she took a slow breath and glanced around, noting the position of each biker, the way they watched her with predatory eyes. She could feel their tension, their impatience building. They were testing her, waiting for her to react. "Here's what's going to happen," the leader continued, his voice growing louder. "You're going to get out of that car, and we're going to have a little chat about respect." He gave a dark chuckle, his eyes gleaming with arrogance. But the woman didn't move. Instead, she straightened her back, squared her shoulders, and met his gaze once again. Her voice, when it came, was steady and cold, but it cut through the tension like a knife. "You're not in control here," she said quietly. "I am." The bikers stopped in their tracks. There was no anger in her voice, no fear, only a quiet confidence that they hadn't expected. For a moment, there was silence, as if the world itself had paused to hear her words. The leader of the bikers blinked, his confidence faltering for just a split second. He hadn't anticipated this. This wasn't what he was used to. He had expected her to shrink away, to beg for mercy, to show the fear he knew was always present in these situations. But instead, she was challenging him, not with force, but with presence. "You think you can intimidate me?" she said, her voice low, cutting through the air with an eerie calm. "Think again." The leader looked around at his gang, uncertainty creeping into his features. The other bikers, who had been eagerly anticipating a confrontation, now seemed unsure. Some exchanged confused glances, while others shifted uncomfortably. The dynamic had changed, and they weren't sure how to react. The woman's gaze remained unbroken, steady, as she waited. "Move," she repeated, her voice colder this time. The bikers stood there, their confidence wavering, their eyes darting back to the woman. Slowly, one by one, they began to back away, unsure of what they had just encountered. The woman sat still in her car, the engine now a low hum in the background, as the bikers slowly backed away. Their faces, once full of arrogance and mockery, had shifted, uncertain. It was as if they couldn't decide whether to challenge her further or walk away from what had suddenly become an unexpected confrontation. The leader, still staring at her, seemed to be sizing her up, trying to figure out what he had missed. "You're really not going to get out of that car, huh?" the leader said after a pause, his voice slightly strained, trying to reclaim some of the dominance he had lost. He stepped forward again, slower this time, his tone no longer the playful mockery it had been before. "I don't need to," she replied simply, her eyes never leaving his. Her voice was calm, unhurried, as though this were nothing more than a passing inconvenience. The leader's jaw clenched. "You think you can just sit there and—" "I don't think," she interrupted, her voice smooth but firm. "I know." The bikers paused again, this time not out of confusion, but from something else, something unspoken, shifting in the air between them. There was a power struggle happening here, but it wasn't the one they were used to. She wasn't reacting the way they expected, and it was beginning to eat at them. A few of the other bikers exchanged glances, looking uncomfortable. One of them, the youngest in the group, scratched his helmet nervously, his eyes flicking from the woman to the leader. He couldn't quite understand why they hadn't just forced her out of the car, why the leader hadn't put an end to this already. But the leader wasn't sure anymore. He stepped back just slightly as though testing the waters. "Look, lady, you're making this harder than it needs to be." "No," she responded, her tone measured but piercing. "You're making this harder. Because I don't need to prove anything to you." He hesitated. The words hung in the air, thick with tension. She was still calm, still composed. The bikers, once certain of their power, were now finding themselves second-guessing their every move. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. "You're really going to just stand there and let me talk to you like this?" the leader asked, trying to regain his composure. His voice wavered, just slightly, as his bravado cracked under the pressure. "I'm not standing," she replied simply, as if the question itself was irrelevant. "And you're not talking to me. You're trying to control me. But you can't." A silence followed her words, longer this time. The bikers glanced around at each other, shifting uneasily. They weren't sure what was happening, but it was starting to feel like they were on the losing side. The usual intimidation tactics weren't working. There was something in the way she spoke, in the way she carried herself, that kept them at bay. The leader's face reddened. He had a reputation to uphold, and in his mind, it couldn't be tarnished by a woman who refused to bow down to him. "I'm giving you one more chance," he snarled, his patience running thin. "Get out of the car." "No." "I told you," she replied, her tone as steady as ever. "You can't control me. Not with words. Not with fear. Not with threats." Her words were like a quiet storm, piercing through the anger and confusion. The bikers were accustomed to being the ones who controlled the space, the ones who instilled fear in others with their mere presence. But this woman was different. She didn't seem afraid. She wasn't intimidated. And it unsettled them more than anything else could. The youngest biker, still standing at the edge of the group, looked at the leader. "What's the plan, man?" "She's not backing down." His voice cracked slightly, betraying his uncertainty. The leader glanced at him, frustration mounting. He stepped forward again, this time with more purpose. "We don't need to deal with this. Let's just get her to leave." The woman's eyes narrowed slightly, and she could sense the shift in their energy. The leader was no longer trying to dominate. He was scrambling, unsure, his mask of confidence slipping. "Get her to leave?" she asked, her voice still calm but now laced with a quiet edge. "You think you can make me leave? What do you think you'll accomplish by that?" Her words cut through the moment of chaos, like a sharp breath of cold air in a stifling room. The bikers looked from one another to her, a strange unease settling over them. They were used to making others squirm, to forcing them to bend, but now, they were the ones who felt out of control. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes intense but not threatening, her voice steady and firm. "You're all stuck in this moment, aren't you? Stuck in the fantasy of power. But you've forgotten one thing." "What's that?" The leader gritted, his voice strained as he fought to regain his position. "You've already lost," she said softly, but with a power that reverberated in the air. And for the first time, the bikers hesitated. They could feel it. Something had shifted, something was different. They had come here expecting a fight, expecting submission, expecting fear. Instead, they found themselves paralyzed in the middle of a mental battlefield, unsure of what had just happened. The silence stretched on, and it wasn't long before they began to realize they were not the predators here. She was. The atmosphere between them was thick with tension, the night air hanging heavy as the bikers stood frozen in place. It was as if the world itself had slowed, the sounds of the highway fading away to a distant hum. The woman remained in her car, her hands resting calmly on the steering wheel, her eyes never wavering from the leader. Her presence had transformed the moment from one of intimidation into a strange, unspoken standoff, one the bikers hadn't expected and weren't sure how to navigate. The leader, once certain that his group was in control, found himself uncertain. The shift had happened so suddenly, and the more he tried to regain his composure, the more he realized that his power was slipping through his fingers. He had pushed, taunted, and threatened, yet this woman had stood unwavering, unmoved by every attempt to break her. His anger began to boil, but beneath it he felt something else, something that made him hesitate. One of the younger bikers shifted on his feet, his helmet making a soft clicking sound as he glanced from the leader to the woman. He had never seen this before. He had watched his gang drive fear into countless people, but the woman was different. She wasn't scared, and it unnerved him more than he cared to admit. The leader took a deep breath, trying to ground himself, to summon the authority that had always been his in these situations. He looked at the other bikers, who now stood with their eyes darting around nervously. They were all waiting for him to make a move, to assert the dominance they were used to. But he couldn't. Not now. "You think you're so smart, don't you?" The leader finally sneered, his voice a mix of frustration and disbelief. "You think you can just sit there and act like you're in control?" The woman's lips barely moved as she spoke. "I'm not acting. I am in control." Her words sent a chill through the group. They hadn't expected this calm certainty. They had expected a plea for mercy, a desperate attempt to placate them. But instead, she had turned their assumptions upside down. The leader clenched his fists, struggling to find the words. "What? You think you can just change the way things work?" "I'm not changing anything," she said, her voice even. "I'm just reminding you of something you've forgotten." The bikers exchanged looks, unease creeping into their expressions. They had expected a confrontation. They had prepared for the usual fear, the usual fight. But they weren't prepared for this quiet power, this slow unraveling of their confidence, piece by piece. "Who do you think you are?" the leader asked again, his voice no longer certain. "Why are you doing this? Why won't you just leave?" She leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing as if the answer was simple, obvious. "Because I'm not afraid of you. And I'm not going to let you control this moment." For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The bikers couldn't speak, couldn't move, as her words settled into the stillness of the night. Her gaze, steady and unflinching, held them captive, but it wasn't her eyes that paralyzed them. It was her voice, her presence. She had cut through their bravado, peeling back the layers of arrogance and revealing their vulnerability. They could feel it now, the fear, the uncertainty creeping in. The woman took a slow, deliberate breath, her fingers lightly brushing the car door handle. It wasn't a movement of fear or hesitation, but one of quiet authority, like she had all the time in the world. "Your biggest mistake," she said softly, "was assuming I was the one who needed to be afraid." The leader flinched at her words. His bravado, the very thing that had made him feel untouchable, was dissolving bit by bit under her unwavering calm. For the first time that night, he felt something he wasn't accustomed to, a sense of powerlessness. One of the other bikers, clearly rattled, shifted his weight from foot to foot, his voice barely audible. What are you trying to do?" "I'm not trying to do anything," she replied. "I'm just waiting for you to realize that you've already lost." Her words were a heavy weight in the air. The silence stretched on, the tension thick enough to be felt in the pit of their stomachs. The leader's hands tightened around the handlebars of his bike, his knuckles white. He was angry, yes, but now there was something deeper simmering beneath the surface. Fear, uncertainty, confusion, they were all beginning to take hold of him and the rest of the group. The younger biker, his voice trembling slightly, spoke again. "You can't just turn this around. We're in control." The woman smiled faintly, the expression almost imperceptible. "You were in control. Until you met me." And with that, the shift was complete. It wasn't with force, it wasn't with a confrontation of physical might. It was with the steady, unwavering certainty that she was the one calling the shots now. The bikers stood there, their once intimidating presence shrinking by the second, the power they thought they held evaporating into the night air. None of them moved. They couldn't. They were frozen, caught in a web of their own fear and uncertainty, while the woman remained seated, the calm center in the chaos they had created. For the first time, they realized that they were the ones who were being controlled. And it terrified them. The stillness in the air was suffocating. The bikers, usually so loud and confident, now stood as if paralyzed. The leader of the group stared at the woman, his eyes wide with disbelief. His mouth moved slightly, but no words came out. His entire world, his sense of power, his dominance over anyone he came across, had just crumbled in the face of her quiet confidence. Around him, the rest of the bikers shifted uncomfortably, their gazes flickering nervously from the woman to one another. The youngest biker, who had been the first to show signs of hesitation, now took a step back. The woman's words had pierced through them like a blade, each of them unsure of how to proceed, unsure of how they had lost control so completely. The leader took a deep breath, his hands still gripping his motorcycle's handlebars as though he were trying to steady himself. The tension was so thick now that even the wind seemed to have stopped, holding its breath along with the bikers. The usual confidence of the group was gone, replaced by a growing, unshakable fear. The leader's voice faltered, the words struggling to escape. You think you've won?" The woman's gaze never wavered. "No," she replied softly, but her voice carried an undeniable strength. "I didn't think I was winning. I knew it. You're the ones who lost." Her words sank in slowly, almost like a quiet storm spreading throughout the group. The bikers, all once so sure of themselves, now stood motionless, unsure of how to move or even what to say. The woman hadn't attacked them, hadn't even raised her voice. All she had done was turn their assumptions upside down. The leader's jaw clenched, but his movements were slow and unsure as he took a step back. For a moment, the bikers looked like they might just turn and leave, their faces etched with confusion, fear, and frustration. But then the youngest biker spoke up, his voice small, almost a whisper. "Why aren't you afraid?" he asked, looking at the woman as if she were something foreign. "Why aren't you scared of us?" The question hung in the air like an invitation. The bikers looked at him, then back at the woman. The shift in the group's dynamic had gone unnoticed by them at first, but now it was undeniable. They had come here expecting to intimidate, to harass, to control. But now, the fear that was coursing through them was palpable. They had met their match. The woman didn't immediately respond. She simply stared at them for a long moment, her expression unreadable. The seconds felt like hours as the tension grew, but she wasn't going to back down. She wasn't going to be intimidated. She knew exactly what she was doing. Finally, after a long pause, she spoke, her voice quiet but certain. "Because I know who I am." The words didn't have to be loud. They didn't need to be forceful. The certainty in her voice, the unwavering calm in her eyes, was enough to strike deep into their hearts. She wasn't afraid of them because she didn't need to be. She wasn't vulnerable. She wasn't weak. And that realization cut through the bikers like a sharp blade. The youngest biker stood there for a long moment, staring at her with wide eyes. The silence stretched, then cracked under the weight of his confusion. "You're not scared," he repeated, his voice quieter this time. It wasn't a statement, more a realization, an understanding that dawned on him like the first light of day. "You're not scared of us at all?" "No," she answered simply. "I'm not." The leader, still unsure of how to respond, looked at his gang. His gaze shifted from one biker to the next, searching for some sign of solidarity, some assurance that they could still take control. But it wasn't there. The others stood frozen, too, their eyes unable to leave the woman, unsure of whether they could keep up the front they had so carefully crafted. The leader finally broke the silence, his voice strained. "You're just one person." The woman tilted her head slightly, considering his words. "I am. And you are many. But numbers don't always equal strength. You've learned that tonight." The realization seemed to sink in for the group. Their power had always been about numbers, about intimidation. They thought they could control anyone they wanted with fear and force. But the woman hadn't played by their rules. She had dismantled their arrogance piece by piece, and now they were left standing there, unsure of who they were or what they were supposed to do next. For the first time, the bikers felt it, their confidence slipping away, their certainty crumbling. They had been so sure they were in control, so sure they could dominate the situation. But this woman, with her calm, unwavering presence, had turned their world upside down. And for all their strength, for all their fearsome reputations, they were paralyzed by a truth they hadn't expected. The woman had won, not with physical force, but with her unshakable self-assurance. And the bikers knew, deep down, that they would never forget this moment. The leader finally turned to his gang, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "Let's go," he muttered, his voice low and filled with frustration. "We're done here." The bikers, still in shock, began to mount their motorcycles. They didn't look at the woman as they revved their engines, the sound of their retreating bikes breaking the stillness of the night. As they disappeared into the darkness, they left behind not just a woman, but the crushing weight of their own fear. And the woman, still sitting in her car, watched them go, her posture unchanged, her confidence unshaken. It was over. And they had learned, in the end, that the greatest strength was not in numbers, nor in intimidation, but in the power of one person who refused to be afraid. The sound of the engines faded into the distance, a low hum that slowly dissolved into the quiet night. The woman remained in her car, her hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, her gaze still focused ahead. The darkness around her seemed to stretch endlessly, but she didn't feel the weight of it. She didn't feel the tension that had once filled the air, the thick, palpable fear that had hung over the bikers. It was over. The moment had passed. And yet, the woman remained still, as though the encounter had simply been another piece of the puzzle, another chapter in a life that had long since learned to face adversity with unshakable resolve. As she sat there, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. She had faced them, 6 bikers, each one towering and intimidating, each one expecting to dominate the situation with their presence and their fear. And they had faltered. They had backed down, unable to cope with the one thing they couldn't predict, her unwavering confidence. In the distance, the faint glow of lights flickered like stars in the night sky, the remnants of a world that had continued on, oblivious to the shift that had just occurred in this small, isolated stretch of road. The woman took a deep breath, letting the calm wash over her. She was alone now, and yet she wasn't. The power she had invoked, the psychological force she had wielded, lingered in the air like an invisible presence. The bikers would talk. They would tell their stories, recount their experiences with the woman who had turned their world upside down without raising a finger. But would they truly understand? Could they? They hadn't just been defeated, they had been exposed. And in that exposure lay something far more terrifying than any physical confrontation: vulnerability. The woman closed her eyes for a moment, letting the stillness of the night settle in her mind. She wasn't just a lone figure on a dark road. She was someone who had learned, over time, the strength of silence, the power of control, and the art of resilience. She had faced down much more than bikers in leather jackets. She had faced doubt, fear, and the expectations of a world that demanded conformity. But she had never bent. And she never would. After a few moments, she turned the key in the ignition and gently pulled the car into gear. The road ahead was long, but it no longer seemed as daunting. She was in control. Always had been. Always would be. As she drove down the road, the headlights illuminating the path ahead, the image of the bikers, defeated and silent, faded into the rearview mirror. They were no longer a threat. No longer a shadow looming over her. It wasn't just that she had won. It was that they had lost. And they would never forget how it felt to be powerless in the face of someone who refused to be afraid.